کنفرانس‌های بین‌المللی با شرکت شخصیت‌های سیاسی، تحلیلگران، متخصصان و پارلمانترها درباره رویارویی مقاومت و قیام مردم ایران با دیکتاتوری آخوندی.
کنفرانس سیاست آمریکا در قبال ایران. سخنرانی‌های سفیر رابرت جوزف، معاون پیشین وزیر امور خارجه آمریکا، ژنرال قبال، جانشین فرمانده نیروهای آمریکا در اروپا 2006، سفیر میچل ریس، مدیر سیاستگذاری وزارت خارجه آمریکا 2005.
Well, no discussion of U.S. policy on Iran would be complete without what you just told us. Let me turn to Ambassador Joseph. Ambassador, you were in charge of arms control, non-proliferation, all matters nuclear, so clearly you have a perspective on what we've seen going back to the first conversations in 2011, or actually before then, during the aughts, when Rouhani and his friends later bragged about lying to European and American and nuclear negotiators. But I want to invite you to go beyond the nuclear file, because you really have studied the entirety of the policy. Give us your thoughts on where we've gone, where we've come from, and where the U.S. should be thinking about going. In a way, I will say, that would be sensible to people regardless of what political party they are in.
سفیر رابرت جوزف، معاون پیشین وزیر امور خارجه آمریکا. یکی از اصول بنیادین سیاست آمریکا ترویج حقوق بشر و دموکراسی است و ما در مورد ایران این اصل را قربانی کرده ایم برای کسب توافقات دیگری که هرگز به واقع برای ما نتیجه خوبی نداشته است.
ما می‌دانیم که میلیاردها و میلیاردها دلار به حمایت از تروریسم، به تجاوزات منطقه‌ای، به برنامه اتمی، به برنامه موشکی و به سرکوب مردم ایران اختصاص یافت. چرا که مردم ایران بالاترین نقطه آسیب پذیری این رژیم هستند.
وقتی با ساکنان در اشراف صحبت می کنید، وقتی با رهبری آنها صحبت می کنید، به ما یک برنامه 10 ماده‌ای ارائه می کنند که چشمانداز آینده را نشان می دهد.
Link, thank you very much. Let me also thank the organizers, the NCRI, of course, and the MEK. As Link says, my background is in the nuclear field, nuclear deterrence, nuclear arms control, nuclear non-proliferation. My first occasion to learn of the NCRI and MEK was in August of 2002. When I was working at the White House, I was an assistant to the president. I was in charge of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear non-proliferation, working very hard on Iran, North Korea, and some of the other challenges that we had. And I'm informed by my staff that there's someone giving a briefing on the Iranian nuclear program. And I get a feedback on what that briefing is all about, and I asked my staff 3 questions. I said, first of all, how does this fellow know more about the Iranian nuclear weapons program than I do? Second, what is a terrorist group doing giving a briefing a block away from the White House? And third, how do I pronounce this guy's last name? Well, since then, I've learned a great deal about the MEK and the NCRI. I've learned of the personal sacrifices of every single member that I've met and talked with. Members who have lost brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers. But in a way that has not at all lessened their dedication, lessened their intention to work toward a free and democratic Iran. It truly is inspiring when you talk to the residents at Ashraf and you talk to the leadership, particularly Mrs. Rajavi, who has provided us with a 10-point plan that provides the vision for the future. And with the MEK and NCRI, we have the alternative to the current regime. So let me just start there in terms of my perspective on US policy. But let me first say that I am of the old school. What I say is not to blame the United States for the many offenses of the Iranian regime, whether it's sponsorship of terrorism, aggression in the region, the pursuit of nuclear weapons, and the brutalization of their own people, the crimes against humanity that they have committed. The fault, the blame lies solely with a regime, with the mullahs who have hijacked the great nation of Iran and Islam itself. So let me sketch out sort of what I see as an alternative to US policy. And I'll let you sort of make the comparison and the contrast with US policy today. I would say that an effective US national security policy toward Iran would be grounded in 4 propositions. This is my academic sort of side coming out here, so excuse me, but 4 propositions. The first proposition is that for 44 years, US policy has failed. It has failed to stop Iran's support of international terrorism. My boss, Condi Rice, referred to it as the international banker for international, the central banker for international terrorism. We have failed to stop Iranian support of aggression in the region. And I think most of all, at least in my view, we have failed in promoting and consistently applying the principle of human rights and democracy that every administration talks about. If you go back through all of the national security strategies, one foundational principle of American policy is the promotion of human rights and democracy. And in the case of Iran, we have sacrificed that principle in order to seek other benefits, other agreements, which have never really turned out well for us. The second principle that I would apply in any national strategy toward Iran is that as long as the mullahs rule, they will never abandon their nuclear weapons program. They simply will not abandon that, and they have proven that over and over. Yes, they will negotiate at times, but the agreements are not worth the paper that they're written on. Maybe that's why we're going to a paperless agreement in the future. Third, and we heard other speakers address this in the previous panels, this is a regime that can't reform. This is a regime that cannot be, as much as we want it to be, a moderate sort of, ruled by moderate leaders. And we have pursued policies that we believed would encourage moderation. I mean, one of the selling points of the JCPOA, despite the fact that it was a fatally flawed agreement, and I testified to that effect before the Senate, but one of the selling points was that the mullahs would take this money and put it into the economy. It would become a benefit to the Iranian people. It would lead to greater pluralism. Well, we know what happened to the billions and billions of dollars. It went into supporting terrorism. It went into regional aggression. It went into their nuclear program. It went into their missile program. And it went into the repression of the people of Iran. And that, I think, is not going to change. So the fourth proposition is that it is the people of Iran that are the greatest vulnerability, that represent the greatest vulnerability of the regime. The regime has alienated its people through brutality, through repression, over 4 decades, through mass murder, through the mass murder of tens of thousands of their own citizens. This is a regime that cannot, as I said, reform, that will continue the brutality until it is ended. And it is that sort of end that we need to think about. But it is the vulnerability from the people that lies at the heart of a different strategy. And that is a strategy that puts human rights up front, puts human rights and the promotion of democracy at the center of the policy. Of course, along with all of the tools of statecraft, with the military tools, with the economic tools, with the diplomatic tools, with the intelligence tools, bringing them all together in an integrated way to contain the regime, to deter and defend against the regime, and ultimately to bring down the regime through the support of the people of Iran. Let me just say what this alternative approach is not. It is not the advocacy of force by the US or the West to overthrow the government of Iran. It's not regime change like we saw in Iraq. I think we've learned our lesson from that. This is regime change, as I said, from within, led by the Iranian people, but supported from the outside, hopefully with the United States as the leader of that support. Because I think we're at that point where further appeasement will truly meet the definition, Einstein's definition of insanity. Okay, trying the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. It's clearly doomed to failure. The alternative that I'm talking about is to support the opposition, the democratic opposition, is to contain and deter the regime from further expansion, from further success along the four lines that I have mentioned. The regime needs to be pressured. I think we're at a critical point. I think we're near the breaking point. And the last thing we need to do is throw the regime a lifeline, as we have in the past. I mean, we need to be realistic about the threat and understand their motivations and understand their vulnerabilities. And I said the greatest vulnerability comes from the people of Iran and the inspirational leadership and the vision that I think is reflected in Mrs. Rajavi's 10-point plan.
Before I turn to Ambassador Rees, I'm going to reach beyond you for a moment to General Wald. We heard a little bit about silver bullets, containment. I want to ask you, you look at all these paramilitary activities that Iran's doing, the proxy forces throughout the Middle East, the guns of explosives going to Yemen, all the activities harassing shipping in the Gulf, trying to sort of stay below the attribution wire, gray warfare. What do we need to be doing physically and in policy to try to counter this physical threat of destabilization from Iran?
ژنرال چاکوار خارجی مماشات و تسلیم به نظر من یک ایده احمقانه است. من فکر می کنم یک گزینه قابل اجرا وجود دارد و آن این است که رژیم ایران ناگزیر خواهد رفت و خبر خوب این است که شما حضور دارید.
First of all, thank you for having me, and it's great to see you, Ambassador, and the other teammates here. You can't wish foreign policy. You've got to kind of treat the world the way it is. In the Middle East, the biggest issue we still have, obviously, is Iran. We've talked about that ad infinitum. This thing about having a non-paper agreement is it just makes me angry. It's cynical. It's phony. It's a way to get out of, I don't want to bother with Iran anymore. I'd like to get away from there. I've got other things to worry about. From the standpoint of the nuclear agreement, it's pathetic. The fact that we're going to have some kind of handshake that says whatever it's going to say, I don't know, but they're already, as Ambassador Joseph mentioned, they're already at 84% purity for the development of a nuclear weapon. They could turn that over in, as was stated, in days. I can't imagine anything worse than Iran having a nuclear weapon. I mean, it's just, so our foreign policy of appeasement and acquiescence right now is really a stupid idea, in my opinion. The beauty of the MEK is that what happens if the Iranians go away from a governmental standpoint? You have a backup. It's called the MEK and NCRI. You have a viable option. I just think that ought to be, our foreign policy ought to be focused on how do we make sure that government that's shown tremendous unity, courage, ability to get things done. These meetings are not trivial. I mean, I've been to a lot of meetings around the world, and some countries couldn't pull off anything one half this size, much less a group like a diaspora. But the good news is there's an alternative to if the Iranian regime were to go away, which I hope it does, the current one. And so we as a country should not be at this point acquiescing to the Iranians on some kind of nuclear agreement that is actually going to arm up the Iranians. I just think there's a viable option. Inevitably, the Iranian regime will go away. The good news is you're there. You got to be careful, because the Iranians, and when they get with their back against the wall or cornered, which they're getting there, they're going to be cornered. They'll do anything, and it's going to be tough. But we need to be there with you. I hope we are. We'll advocate for it. I think our foreign policy is weak right now, and we should do better. Sorry.
Thank you.
سفیر میچل ریس، مدیر سیاستگذاری وزارت خارجه آمریکا 2005. این رژیم نامشروع است، به وضوح از حمایت مردم برخوردار نیست. ما این را هر روز در اعتراضات شجاعانه تحت رهبری زنان در ایران می‌بینیم.
این رژیم نه می‌خواهد و نه می‌تواند تغییر کند. سرکوب را افزایش می‌دهد، چون شکننده تر شده و حمایت داخلیش از بین می رود.
برای تسریع روند پایان این رژیم چه کار می توان کرد؟ باید بگویم که در رأس آن حمایت از اپوزیسیون، به طور خاص شورای ملی مقاومت ایران و سازمان مجاهدین است.
And now, Mitchell, I'm going to ask you something that Colin Powell would have asked you when you were his policy planning chief. The president has just asked for a refresh on a new approach to Iran. That was your job. Give us your thoughts on what that would look like.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Lincoln. I want to thank my distinguished panelists and the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back with you all again. I think, listening very carefully to my colleagues on this panel and the previous panels, I think that we can all agree on three big things, not just among us here, everybody in the audience, and hopefully everybody who's watching this around the world. The first thing is that the current regime in Iran presents a clear and present danger. It is an ongoing threat, not only domestically, but also to the United States and to friends and allies around the world. The latest worldwide threat assessment by the U.S. intelligence community in February 2023 highlights the threats that Iran poses. They continue to be the leading state sponsor of terrorism for many, many years now in a row. The head of MI5 recently said that in the last 18 months, the Iranian regime has tried to either abduct or assassinate 15 UK citizens or UK people, individuals living in the UK. 15 over the last year and a half. This is a regime that clearly has a dangerous posture towards the rest of the world. I think we all agree on that. The second thing is that the regime is illegitimate. It clearly doesn't have the support of its people. We see that every day by the brave protests led by the women in Iran and the people that have made incredible sacrifices opposing this regime. It is illegitimate fundamentally. And the third big thing that I think we can all agree upon is that, as Bob Torricelli said earlier, it's unwilling and unable to change. Hope springs eternal in the hearts of some people that it's going to moderate itself, that it's going to evolve, that over time it'll be more reasonable. There's no indication that that's true. In fact, there's an argument that the reverse is happening. They're becoming more repressive as they become more fragile with their domestic support eroding. So I think those are fundamental truths that we can all agree upon. So then that leads to what's the key policy question? And I think the key policy question is this: what can we do to accelerate the end of this regime? What can we do to accelerate the end of this regime? And I think that we can do quite a few things, actually, some of which we're doing, perhaps not as effectively as we could be, some things that are perhaps a little bit new. So let me just read a list of things that we could be doing. Lincoln and I were talking earlier about exposing the human rights violations and the appalling human rights record of this regime. Governments can do this. Parliamentarians can do this. The UN Human Rights Commission should do this. Not just Amnesty International. Everybody should know the true nature of this repressive regime. So again, this gets back to Bob Joseph's comment about values. Values that we share are the dignity of the individual. This regime doesn't care for that. We need to expose that. The second thing we can do is expose the corruption of the mullahs, of the IRGC, of the Basij. They've all taken millions of dollars from the Iranian people, and they've deposited in overseas bank accounts. We have a pretty good idea of who's done that and where it's deposited. Let's expose them and feed that information back to the Iranian people. Third thing is increasing the sanctions. Clearly, sanctions have not had the effect of toppling the regime, but they do inflict some pain. And as Steve McCabe said earlier, if they're going to expire, then they need to be renewed and strengthened. Another thing we need to do is to increase the amount of news that gets into Iran. And again, what can we do to accelerate the end of this regime? I have to say, at the very top, is to support the opposition, especially the NCRI and the MEK. There's more than we can all do to support them. There's much more that our governments can do. That, along with all these other measures, I think will be the best possible holistic approach to ending this reign of tyranny in Tehran and welcoming a new democracy for the Iranian people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitchell.